what I think you'll find an extremely interesting aspect of this subject. Because Nimrod comes into Israel, also comes into Judah. And we're going to see in our study this session and a session or two down the track, both of those Nimrodian apostasies that occur. First is in Israel and the second is in Judah. We're going to see how important that is in the scheme of things. So just as we saw last evening that the apocalypse was in Joshua, so the apocalypse is also in the book of Kings. And Christ gave us the clue to that when in Revelation chapter 2 he writes his letter through John to the ecclesia at Thyatira, because he calls a certain class of individuals in that ecclesia Jezebel. So there were people in that ecclesia who were doing what Jezebel did of old, but doing it in a slightly different form. She, of course, introduced literal fornication as well as spiritual fornication. Christ is talking about spiritual fornication, spiritual idolatry that was coming into the ecclesia of Thyatira. And so we're going to just pause and have a brief look at what was happening in that ecclesia and see why it is that Christ uses that term Jezebel of that class of people. He's actually asking us to go back to the roots, to go back to where the story of Jezebel occurs, and we're going to see exactly what was happening. Jezebel, of course, modelled herself on Semiramis and brought Baal, that is, Cush and Nimrod worship into Israel. So she was just a successor of Semiramis. The destruction of Ahab's house that followed, of course, the divine judgments pronounced upon Ahab and his house, the death of Jezebel, and the annihilation of all Baal worshippers in the land right down to the last man and woman, prefigured the events of the 40-year judgment that Christ and the saints will play out beyond Armageddon. That 40 years is designed ultimately to destroy all Baal worshippers out of this earth. Now, by Baal worshippers, we mean those who follow the doctrines and the practices of Nimrod and Semiramis. You know, basically the Catholic system and its harlot daughters who will not change their ways post-Armageddon. They'll be given a chance to change their ways, but those who don't will have to be destroyed. In fact, they're given 2 or 3 chances to change their ways. And those who persist will be destroyed and removed. Just like Jehu removed all Baal worshippers from Israel. So all that's a type. It's a type of things to come. And we're going to see that when we come back and have a look at the record of Kings. But I want to start with where we basically left off last evening, and that is just to link Joshua here to this story about Ahab and Jezebel. It's very important. We did speak about this after one of the sessions, I think. But let's do it now officially. I want you to come back to Joshua chapter 6 and verse 26. At the same time, those of you who are nimble of fingers can turn to the first of Kings, chapter 16, verse 34. And you'll see the obvious reason for this when we get to these two accounts. In Joshua chapter 6 and verse 26, in the wake of the destruction of Jericho, this is what we read. Verse 26, and Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, cursed be the man before Yahweh, so it's pretty important, it's before Yahweh, that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. Now, that was fulfilled, you might say, when a man called Hiel decided that he was going to be this one who would rebuild Jericho. So if you just keep your hand in Joshua 6 and come across to 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 34, which, of course, is right on the tail end of the history of Ahab and how he introduced Baal worship into Israel through Jezebel. It says in verse 34, in his days, that is in Ahab's days, did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. Now I find that very interesting. He's a Bethelite. His name, Hiel, means living of God. He was as dead as a doornail from the shoulders up. He had nothing in his brain except apostasy. Did this man? He was not living of God. It's a great misnomer. In fact, it comes from the root word meaning to revive. Yeah, he's reviving something, but it's nothing to do with living of God. And in fact, the opposite happens to this man, because not only does he die eventually, but all of his sons. So his heritage in Israel is wiped out. All of his sons are lost. He's not living of God. Now, he's a Bethelite. Now, you know what happened at Bethel. It first comes into the scriptural record in Genesis 12 verse 8. It's where Abraham chose the house of God rather than going to the east to ruin, to Hai. Okay, so that's the first thing where he called upon the name of Yahweh, began that worship which brought him ultimately through the purging of his transgressions, the turning away of his iniquities, brought him to the end of those promises. And he, of course, is effectively in the kingdom because, as Christ said, the patriarchs live unto God. Now, this man, Hiel, his name means living of God, but he's going to perish eternally. So that's interesting. But of course, there's something else that happened at Bethel, wasn't there? Another apostasy. The first apostasy in Israel occurred at Bethel. Someone can tell me who that was that introduced the first apostasy at Bethel? Name? Jeroboam the first. Okay? He was the man who set up the golden calves, two of them, one in Bethel. Of course, he inaugurated his new religion at Bethel, and then he put the other calf way up in Dan, in the north. Came a sin because they preferred to go to Dan. They had to 3 times as far over mountains. They went to Dan. That's just the perversity of human nature, isn't it? It was much easier to go to Bethel, but they went to Dan. It's a bit like saying to some people, listen, you can come to a school of the prophets and sit for 3 days and focus your mind wholly on the Word of God, or you can go to to the local football match or the baseball match or whatever. But that's in Los Angeles, and some people would go to Los Angeles and prefer to come in preference to coming to a place like this. That's the way human nature is. So that was a sin in Israel because they went to Dan, or judgment as that word means. Now what happens to this man? See here in 1 Kings 16:34. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn. Now Abiram means father of height. In other words, this was a pretension. This was a project for Hiel's benefit. This was going to elevate him in the scheme of things, so he thought. And so he lays the foundations when his son Abiram is born. And of course, Abiram dies. And that was the signal of what God intended. And then we read, goes on to say, he set up the gates thereof in his youngest son, Segub. Now, Segub means aloft, from the root inaccessible. So together with all the sons, he might have had, as I said last evening, many sons in between. There might have been 10 of them, or we don't know. We're not told. But all of the sons that were born to this man perished between the time that he laid the foundations and the time when he put up the gates, which is the last thing you do in building a city. So the project was a disaster from beginning to end. So when he put up the gates, he doesn't have any sons to perpetuate his dynasty, his family life in that city. He is decimated. And of course, that's exactly what's going to happen to the system that we're talking about. The Nimrodian system. It's going to be utterly destroyed. Now we saw, of course, that Joshua 6 last night was the Armageddon chapter in the types of the book of Joshua. That's very important, because what we're going to see here in the story of Ahab and Jezebel and this Babylonian apostasy that they brought into Israel, we're going to see the entire pattern. The pattern of the destruction of this system from Armageddon to the ultimate destruction of all Baal worshippers. It's the framework, the prophetic framework, you might say, for the apocalypse. So let's have a look then at where this all begins. It begins with the hint that is given to us by Christ. Now, you might want to come to to Revelation chapter 2 with me. And here we have the letter written by Christ through John to the ecclesia at Thyatira. It begins in verse 18. I'm not going to go into all of the details of this because it would be a session in its own right. I want you to just have a look with me at verse 19. By the way, the symbols that are used in verse 18 have to do with judgment. His eyes, the symbol of intelligence, spiritual intelligence, are like unto a flame of fire, the symbol of divine judgment. His feet like fine brass. In other words, they've been on fire. So these are the symbols for judgment. So when Christ introduces himself to Thyatira, it's with judgment in his eyes, as it were. He doesn't like what's happening in this ecclesia at all. And in verse 19, he tells us, at least begins to tell us why. I know thy works and love and service and faith and thy patience and thy works. Oh, now that's interesting. That's the second time he's mentioned works. That's very important because what's happening in our brotherhood today happened to Thyatira. They went from being an ecclesia that focused on getting things right doctrinally and practicing right and doing good to all men, to a community that didn't worry about doctrine but did a whole lot of good works like the churches do. Now that's happening in our community today. We are becoming, as an organisation, a community, we are becoming very much focused on works. And there's nothing wrong with works. We've got to do good works. I mean, if you're not doing good works, then you haven't got faith. But you see, the focus is on works. And that's what Christ puts his finger on. He says, I know your works. I know your love. I know your service. And your faith. Yeah, you've got people in that ecclesia, terrific. And your patience and endurance under trial, I know all that thing. And your works. Yeah. So they're commended for works, love and service, faith and endurance. But there's a hint. The more works is that there's a focus on doing, not a focus on doctrine. And of course, works backed up by wrong doctrine or based on wrong doctrine are useless to God. Useless to God in the end. They're criticised for toleration of a seducing Jezebel class. And he lays upon them just one burden. He wants them to do one thing, and that's in verse 24. But unto you, he says, I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine. What doctrine? Well, the doctrine of Jezebel, of verse 20. We'll come back to that in a second. He says, have not this doctrine, which have not known the depths of Satan as they speak, I will put upon you none other burden. And of course the burden he's laying upon them is to do with the Jezebel class what Jehu did with Jezebel and the Baal worshippers that she had seduced. So verse 20 is very important, isn't it? Now many of you would be aware that when you read verse 20 you need to omit some words. It reads this way. Notwithstanding, I have, it says in the King James Version, a few things against thee. Not correct. The phrase, a few things, can be omitted. What he says to them is, notwithstanding I have against thee. And he only mentions one thing. So he's not talking about a few things. He only mentions one thing. And that's their toleration of the teaching of wrong doctrine by a Jezebel class. And that's what they had to get right. Because if you undermine doctrine, you undermine access to eternal life. And I just want to emphasise that particular principle. But before I do that, let's just read the rest of verse 20. Notwithstanding, I have against thee, because thou sufferest, which the word in the Greek means to let, to permit, not to hinder. You allow the activity of this group of people. Thou sufferest that woman, Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, so they claimed to be teachers, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication, meaning, of course, spiritual fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. So to turn away to another form of religion, you might say. And to twist the truth, to end up with something different to what they were originally given. That's what he's talking about here. Now, he lays upon them that burden to get rid of that class. And of course, some of the ecclesias that Christ writes to had done that. A division had occurred, for example, in Philadelphia. And it was coming in other places as well, because of wrong doctrine, which could not be tolerated. So why? Why was judgment impending? You have a look at what he says here in verse 21. There's always got to be a process to sort out this sort of matter. In verse 21 it says, I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. So obviously this class had been opposed within the ecclesia. That was Christ giving them space to repent. Behold, I will cast her into a bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. And I will kill her children with death. Well, I'm not really sure what else you'd kill them with, but that's a pretty good way of saying destroy them, isn't it? I will kill her children with death, and all the ecclesia shall know that I am he which searcheth the reins and the hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works. So, this is a pretty powerful little letter, isn't it? But it's all based upon Ahab and Jezebel of the past, and we're going to see that, and see how important that is in the scheme of things. Now, some of you may be aware that the 7 letters of the Apocalypse are really prophetic of 7 periods from the time of John on the Isle of Patmos down to our own day. So that, for example, we are in the Laodicean period. And Brother Mansfield thinks that began after the Second World War, because that's when prosperity began to burgeon in the earth, on the back of the Second World War. For example, in the 1950s, Australia was riding on the sheep's back. And in the 1950s, America was riding on the back of Texas oil and things like that. It was the time when prosperity began to burgeon in our earth. So we're in the Laodicean epoch. And we know that's true. Can anybody tell me why we're in the Laodicean epoch? From the letter to the Laodiceans itself?
Yeah, there's no right or wrong, everything's grey area.
Yeah, character of the times, prosperity, who cares sort of attitude. But there's something more important. It's the only letter where you find these words. Yes, maybe. Yeah. It's the only letter where you find the words, behold, I stand at the door and knock. In other words, Christ is about to come. You don't find those words in the other letters. So it's the one. He's telling you, Christadelphians in the 21st century, this is your letter, because I'm coming in your era of prosperity. And we know that Christ will come and take the saints out of prosperity. Not from poverty. Don't expect to line up at soup kitchens. You're not going to have to line up at a soup kitchen. Yeah, the world's economy is going to collapse soon, but you won't be lining up at a soup kitchen. You'll be the judgment seat. That's the message. We will be taken from prosperity. And you want proofs? Luke 17, verse 20 to 36. Luke 21, verses 34 to 36. Revelation chapter 3, verses 14 onwards. You want proof? Absolute proof that Christ is going to come and take his servants from prosperity, not from times of tribulation. The churches, particularly the Pentecostal churches, teach a whole heap of rubbish about that. They apply Matthew 24, the Great Tribulation, to verse 19. They apply that to our times. It's rubbish. Some Christadelphians have been caught up by that. So be careful. We will be taken from prosperity, not from hardship. And that's our trial. In a world of technology and prosperity of every kind, that's our trial. That's the trial of Lot's wife, wasn't it? That's why he said, remember Lot's wife. So that's very important to know. These letters are critical. They are historical facts, of course, of what was happening in those ecclesias, but they're actually prophetic of periods of ecclesial history ever since the times of John, and we're in the Laodicean. Now the Thyatiran epoch is from AD 606 to 1572. Anybody know what happened in 1572? It's the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. Thank you, Nathan. All right? Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, when true witnessing came to an end. And Jezebel was ascendant through the papal system, had complete control. All right? So that's why this letter is important in relation to prophecy. Now, let me just emphasise that point about purity of doctrine. I don't think I really need to take you here, but I'm going to take you here. 1 Timothy chapter 4. The Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy in Ephesus, and he says this in 1 Timothy 4 verse 12. Let no man, he says, despise thy youth. So you can be spiritually intelligent when you're 40 years of age, which is what Timothy was. You can be very spiritually intelligent. Don't let any man despise your youth. But be thou an example of the believers in word, in manner of life, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. Till I come, give attendance to reading. He means the public reading of the Bible. Very important to read the Bible properly, publicly. To exhortation, to doctrine or teaching. And then he goes in to talk about the gift that Timothy had been given. Then in verse 15 he says, meditate upon these things. The word means to take care of, by implication to revolve in the mind. So revolve in your mind, he says, upon the things you've been taught, Timothy. Give thyself wholly to them. In actual fact, in the literal Greek it should be in them. That's what it means in the Greek. To be totally involved in them, that thy profiting or advancement or progress may appear or be manifested to all. Take heed unto thyself, the first thing you've got to take care of, and unto the doctrine. Doctrine or teaching or instruction is critical. Why? Because he says, continue in them, for in doing this thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee. Get doctrine wrong, good night, nurse. Finished, finito. That's what he's saying. You've got to have doctrine right. And if you allow it to go wonky, like some did, go back to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 19, he says, holding faith and a good conscience, which some having put away concerning faith, have made shipwreck, of whom, he says, is Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have delivered unto Satan. In other words, put them out of fellowship, that they may learn not to blaspheme. They had their doctrines wrong. And wrong doctrine invariably leads to wrong practice. You know that's true, don't you? He says in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and at verse 9, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for whoremongers, they that defile themselves with mankind, in other words, homosexuals, men stealers, liars, perjured persons. Then he says this, and if there be any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine. There is a nexus between doctrine and practice. You get your doctrines wrong, it's likely the practice will end up being wrong at some point. That's the teaching of Paul. You've got to have it. That's why Christ is so critical of the Ecclesia Thyatira, because they tolerated a Jezebel class who were teaching wrong doctrine. And of course, as we know from Titus chapter 3 verses 1 to 11, where Paul says that after the second and third admonition, a heretic should be rejected. And Galatians 1, 8 and 9, he says, if any other man, he includes angels, if any other man teach any other gospel than that which you have heard from me, let him be accursed, let him be excommunicated from Christ. So it's pretty clear how important doctrine is. Well, doctrine was defiled in Israel. It had been defiled by Jeroboam, by his Bethel exercise, and now it was defiled by Ahab bringing Jezebel into Israel with her Babylonian apostasy. So let's come back then to 1 Kings 16. That's the easy part. All right? So how are you coping? You all right? You going okay? Good. I'm watching you.
I'm trying.
Yeah. I know you're trying. 1 Kings 16, we have the record of Omri comes to the throne on the back of fishes. Terrible events. Women being ripped up with child and all sorts of Assyrian practices going on in the civil war. With Tibni, the man of straw, his name means. Anyway, eventually Omri is ascendant. And he establishes this dynasty that we see is actually based in many ways upon Cush and Nimrod. Remember the formula? I need to repeat it again, do I? All right. The ideology of Omri is put into effect by Ahab, just as the ideology of Cush was put into motion by Nimrod. So Omri is a statute maker, and he's certainly a builder, because he's the man who builds the city of Samaria, buys the hill from Shema, and after that man's name, he builds the city of Samaria. We read that record in 1 Kings 16, verses 23 to 28. I'm not going to read all through that, but I am going to read the end of verse 28, which says that when Omri dies, Ahab his son reigned in his stead. Now Ahab goes down in history as the worst king of Israel, and there were pretty bad kings in Israel. In fact, there wasn't one good king in Israel, and they were all pretty bad. And when we get towards the end, they were brutal in the extreme. He was the worst. Why? Well, we don't read about him putting too many people to death, or we know Jezebel tried to kill the prophets and that sort of thing, and she did. It wasn't so much on that angle. Oh yeah, he sort of went along with Jezebel when she killed off Naboth and his sons, but his problem was he introduced Baal worship into Israel. He had a deliberate policy, probably based on the advice of his father, to bring Baal worship into Israel. And that's what God says here. Look at verse 30. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of Yahweh above all that were before him. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And worse than that, he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal which he had built in Samaria. He made a grove. He did more to provoke Yahweh, God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. And that's why at the end of this chapter you've got the reference to Joshua 6:26. Because you see, Jericho was the heartland of Nimrodian worship, Baal worship in the land of Canaan. God devoted it to destruction, cursed the man who would rebuild it, and the man who rebuilt it did so in the days of Ahab, because Ahab was the man who brought Baal worship back. That's why it happens in the times of Ahab. He's the man who brings Jericho back, essentially. Baal worship is back. Well, there he is, the implementer of the ideologies of Omri, the builder of Canaanite worship. Nimrod is back in the land of Israel. Now he marries this woman Jezebel. Her name means chaste, not C-H-A-S-E-D, although she was. She had 400 boyfriends, remember? So they chased her around. But no, her name means chaste, as in pure. C-H-A-S-T-E. But that's a misnomer, isn't it? A bit like Hail. That's a misnomer. She was the most unchaste woman of the time, just like Semiramis had been the most unchaste woman of her time. She was a mother of harlots, like her forerunner. Now she was the daughter of Ethbaal. Ethbaal means with or near Baal, and she never left Baal all of her days. And, of course, it was her that influenced Ahab to his evil. So just turn across to chapter 21 of 1 Kings. 1 Kings 21. Where you read in verse 25 and 26 these words. But there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of Yahweh, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. Now that word stirred up, there's a very interesting Hebrew word. It's the word sooth, C-U-W-T-H. Nothing soothing about it, by the way. It means to prick, with a pin, to stimulate someone, like an ox goad being used on an animal. Here, do this. That's what Jezebel was like with Ahab. She was always prodding him. Come on, how about a new temple for Baal? Come on. How about we chase those prophets of Yahweh? Come on, what are you doing? Get on, get moving. That was Jezebel. And Ahab tried the same thing on a wonderful man called Jehoshaphat, remember? In the record it says, and the same Hebrew word is used, that he influenced him to go up to Ramoth Gilead to fight against his enemies. Of course, it was a disaster. Same Hebrew word is used. So that's what she did. She was always standing by. What does it say here? Verse 26. And he did very abominably in following idols according to all the things as did the Amorites. Yeah. You know where the Amorites were, don't you? Yeah, in Jericho. Whom Yahweh cast out before the children of Israel. So Baal worship was back because of this woman. She was the one that goaded Ahab to make sure that it was fully installed in Israel. But God has an answer. He's always got an answer, hasn't he? And that's why 1 Kings 17 is there. 1 Kings 17 verse 1 is God's answer. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As Yahweh Elohim of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. So how long was that? How many years? Let's be exact.
3 years.
Yeah. 3.5 years. How many days? 1260. Right? And we're going to see how important that is in the scheme of things. There's a wonderful collusion here in these events with other prophecies, as we're going to see. So what does God do? Well, you've got Jezebel, the mother of harlots, who's the type of the Roman Catholic apostasy arising from the brotherhood, and that's what Revelation 2 is about. The letter to the Thyatirians is a warning by Christ that Nimrod was going to come back into business through the ecclesia. The apostasy would come out of the ecclesia, just like it had out of the family of Noah. It would come out of the ecclesia. I said the other day, never forget that fact. Catholicism comes from Christadelphia. That's where it came from. So here we've got this woman who brings about this Catholic apostasy, which is what it ultimates at, arising out of the brotherhood in the times of the ecclesia of Thyatira, the turn of the century. So what's God's answer? Well, we're going to see. It's Elijah. But you see, Jezebel in Israel has a companion in Judah. And her name is Athaliah. I want you to turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 22. Second Chronicles chapter 22. We're going to read verses 2 to 4. It says in verse 2, 40 and 2 years old. Now, some of you will have made the change. It should read 20 and 2 years old. Because if you look at the companion account, and you'll see a note in your margin along those lines, you look at the companion account in Kings, Ahaziah was actually 22 years of age. It was impossible for him to be 42, by the way, when you do the numbers. He was 22 years old. So someone's played with that. We don't know how that happened, but someone has changed that. 22 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign. And he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. Huh? No, she wasn't. Athaliah wasn't the daughter of Omri. She was the granddaughter of Omri. She's the daughter of Ahab at least. We know that much. And because she was married off to the prospective king of Judah, she probably was also the daughter of Jezebel. I don't think they would have had a second ranking one given away in that prominent position. We know she's certainly the daughter of Ahab. That's spelled out in the scriptures. So she's not the daughter of Omri. So why is that there? Well, I'll tell you why. Just read on. Verse 3. He also walked in the ways, this is Ahaziah, walked in the ways of the house of Ahab. Notice what it says. The ways of the house of Ahab. Why? For his mother was his counsellor to do wickedly. Wherefore he did evil in the sight of Yahweh like the house of Ahab, for they were his counsellors after the death of his father to his strength. Do you remember Micah 6 verse 16? For the statutes of Omri are kept, and all the works of the house of Ahab. You have a statute maker and a performer. Alright? You have an ideologue and someone who carries it into effect. That's the formula. That's the Cush-Nimrod formula. That was seen in Omri and Ahab, and it was also seen manifest in Judah with Athaliah and Ahaziah. And that's why she's called the daughter of Omri, because Omri was the statute maker of Israel. Right? That's the way the scripture is written. It's written deliberately. And we would say, well, that's a mistake. No, it's not a mistake. It's the way it's written in order to get a message across. So here is the problem. What's the answer? Well, God raises up witnesses, and we read about Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 1. So what kind of witness do you think Elijah was? Well, he was a religious witness, wasn't he? A religious witness against an apostate system or an apostate church. And that's why this is a wonderful type. And I want to show you that, because I want you to come to Revelation chapter 11. So Elijah is raised up. He's Yahweh's prophet. He's the messenger of the covenant. We read of in Malachi, as it were. That's the basis of that. And how long does he hold back rain from heaven? How long is his ministry, you might say? 3.5 years. 1,260 days. 42 months. Same period, isn't it? Well, that's what Revelation 11 is drawn from. Have a look at Revelation 11, verse 1. And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein, but the court, which is without the temple, leave out. So it's talking about what was happening in the brotherhood, or what would happen in the brotherhood. There would be a faithful inner circle or remnant, described as the temple and altar, but the court would be the apostate section of the community. Right? Don't measure that. Then it says this. This rod, by the way, is a rod of oppression. So there's a persecution by the apostate section of the so-called Christian community against those who still held the truth. Verse 2. Court, which is without, leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So there was going to be a division in Christianity, to use that term in its widest sense. And there would be those who would defend the truth, a very small remnant, against the majority who had apostatized. That's what this prophecy is about. Now there are two separate periods here. Same length of time, but described differently. You see there in Revelation 11, and at verse 2 it says, they shall tread underfoot this holy city 42 months. Now 42 months in biblical terms is 1260 days, or 3.5 years, so to speak. That's the period of papal ascendancy from the decree of Focus in 608-610 AD to the loss of the Pope's temporal power 1868-1870. But the other period, same length of time as in verse 3, covers a different period of history. I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now, who are these 2 witnesses, do you think? Well, it's a very simple formula. God raised up 2 witnesses against the growth of the papal system, the apostasy. One was a religious witness, that is, those within the community originally who fought against that apostasy. They're the religious witness. And the other was a political witness. Now, the political witness were people who had no real interest in religion, but were not going to let this Roman Catholic system dominate them through the Roman government. So the Circumcellions and others rose up and we're not going to have this mob in Rome who are ruled basically by the Pope. We're not going to have them imposing upon us their religion. So they objected to it. So there was a religious witness in those who stood for truth, and there was a political witness in those who refused to be dominated by that system. Now, they're actually matched back in Old Testament. You're going to see in a minute. So what's this period about? This period in verse 3. They shall prophesy 1,260 days. And it's precisely the same length as 42 months, isn't it? 1,260 years on a day for a year principle. Precisely the same length, but it actually starts at a different time. It starts in 312 AD, when Constantine, with the help of the apostate Christians, established that system that led to the full-blown Catholicism and the papal rule that later followed. 312 AD was, as we're going to see a bit later on in our studies, the birth of the man of sin. I think we might have already mentioned that, but we're going to see that. The birth of the man of sin, 312 AD. It terminated in 1572 with the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, when effective witnessing against the papal system came to an end. Now, to be sure, the witnesses were not actually put to death until the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. They weren't actually put to death, but effective witnessing against the system ended in 1572. So in history, that 1260-year period from 312, 1572, is that period where there's oppression and the witnessing goes on until they're effectively put out of business. Got it? Okay. Well, now we can read on. We needed all that to read on. So let's do that. Verse 4. Revelation 11, verse 4. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. Now, this is not the God of heaven. All right? And when it says standing before, the word before in the Greek, in opion, means in the view of. In other words, this is about the witnesses, the religious witness and the political witness, these 2 groups of people who in fact didn't even know each other all that well. Know each other all that well. But they were standing in the presence of the God of the earth. Who's that? Nimrod's successor. Nimrod was the first god of the earth. And the Pope is his successor. So they were standing against the God of the earth, the papacy. But read on, verse 5. And if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. These, here's our critical verse, these have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy. Where's that coming from? These have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their... How long's their prophecy? 3.5 years. How long did rain stop when Elijah walked into the palace of Ahab? 3.5 years. See where it's coming from? That's why this history of Ahab and Jezebel is so important for Bible prophecy. It's not history. Yes, it's history. But it's not history. It's prophecy. Alright? It's historical prophecy. That's its importance. Nothing in the Word of God, except perhaps in the book of Genesis, which is the book of the roots of the Scripture, nothing in the Word of God is without roots somewhere before it. You always find some roots somewhere before it. That's where the roots of what Christ says in Revelation 11 come from this history of Ahab and Jezebel. So if Elijah constitutes God's religious witness, who might be his political witness? Well, I want you to come back to 1 Kings chapter 18. Because we meet him. We meet him in the person of Obadiah. And Obadiah's name means the servant of Yah. And he was that, but he was something else as well. In the record of 1 Kings 18, we read this in verse... Let's take it up from verse... we don't want to read all of that. Verse 5 of 1 Kings 18. It says this. And Ahab said unto Obadiah, and this is when Yahweh sent Elijah to meet Ahab. Ahab said to Obadiah, go into the land unto all the fountains of water and unto all brooks, we might find some grass to keep the remaining horses and mules alive. They divided the land between them, it says in verse 6, to pass throughout. Ahab went one way by himself. That's a very interesting phrase. And Obadiah went another way by himself. Now, this Obadiah is an extremely faithful man. And as you read on, you find that he says to Elijah when he meets him, haven't you heard about me? Because Elijah doesn't know him. But he says to Elijah, haven't you heard about me? You're a prophet of Yahweh. Haven't you heard that I've preserved at least 100 prophets in 2 separate companies of 50 from being slaughtered by Jezebel? Haven't you heard about that? No, never heard of it. This man is God's political witness because he was the right-hand man to Ahab. He was in the government. He had a say in the government. The right-hand man of Ahab, and he's working against the government. He's working to preserve Yahweh's prophets that Jezebel wants murdered. He's in the politics of the time. He's the political witness against Ahab and Jezebel. Couldn't get a better type than that. And the fact is that while Obadiah knew a bit about Elijah, Elijah didn't know anything about Obadiah. And in history, the political witness, knew a little bit about the internal rumblings of the Christian community, but they didn't really know what it was all about. But the religious witness didn't have much idea about the political witness. You could not get a more precise type than that. That's how accurate it is. So what happens then in the wake of all of this? Well, we know what happens in 1 Kings 18. All Israel is called up to Mount Carmel, and you're familiar with the events of Mount Carmel. You know that eventually Elijah calls down fire from heaven, and that brings about the repentance of Israel. Have a look at it with me. Verse 38 of 1 Kings 18. Then the fire of Yahweh fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water, etc. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, Yahweh, He is the God. Not that idiot Baal that won't answer his prophets. Yahweh's the God. And Elijah said, take those prophets, get rid of them. And they killed the 450 of them. Alright? Not the 400 that Jezebel kept home. The 450 who came up and made idiots of themselves on Mount Carmel. So this was a day of conversion. Problem was, Elijah ran away. He didn't stop for too long to educate. He brought fire from heaven, he got their attention, but he didn't stay to educate. We're going to see the meaning of that in a minute. Now, I'm going to suggest to you, as we do here on the screen, that the fire from heaven in the type actually represents Armageddon. You know what Armageddon's called by Christ in Matthew 24 verse 30? The sign of the Son of Man in heaven. You want proof of that? Brother Thomas told us the proof in 1850. The proof is Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. When you put Matthew 24 verse 30 together with Revelation chapter 1 verse 7, you have the proof that the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, heaven meaning government, Son of Man being the title of Christ as judge of all the earth, Armageddon is that sign. It's a sign to the Jews, it's a sign to the world. It will bring about, of course, the reformation of the remaining remnant of Judah. That's what happened when fire came from heaven. It brought about at least the beginnings of a reformation. It just wasn't followed through. So when fire came from heaven on Mount Carmel, it was a type of Armageddon. But you see, that wasn't the end of divine judgments in this time, was it? Because you see, Jehu comes along. Now, anybody know what the name Jehu means? It means Yah is He. He's the representative of God to bring divine judgment into Israel to get rid of the house of Ahab and all Baal worshippers in Israel. In other words, he's there as a type, as it were, of our Lord Jesus Christ, who will come as Yah, Yah is He, divine representative on the earth to destroy the worship of Nimrod. Now, I believe that when Jehu slays Jezebel, that is a type of Rome, the city, the centre of Babylonian religion today, 10 years after Armageddon. So there's a space, isn't there, between the events of Carmel and the killing of Jezebel. There's a space. Just like there will be a space between Armageddon and the destruction of Rome as a centre of religion. Then, of course, we have the house of Ahab being annihilated over the next period of time. And this happens by stages. You know, you've got the 70 sons that were in Samaria, that were brought by the elders of Jezreel who were in Samaria. And that's a wonderful poetic justice story. We won't go into that, I haven't got time to go into that. Robbie would like me to do that, but can't do that now. So you've got the annihilation of the house of Ahab. That's a representation of Babylon the Great being destroyed in what's called the hour of judgment. The 30-year period, the hour of judgment. But then, the last major event is that in the company of Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, Jehu invites all Baal worshippers, and he makes sure that every single one of them's there, and that there's no worshippers of Yahweh there. In fact, that's Jehonadab's requirement. No worshipper of Yahweh's there in that place, and not one of those Baal worshippers survives. And that, of course, is the end of those who insist on remaining supporters of the papacy. After 2 or 3 warnings, if they persist, there's only one end for them: destruction. So all of that is spelled out in this type. in the times of Ahab and Jezebel. Just exactly as you would expect it to be. Now, you'll see reference there to Revelation 19. I'm going to take you there in a minute, Revelation 19, 20 and 21, because this is the prophecy that is based on what happens back here in the times of Ahab. Let's go to Revelation, but let's come first to Revelation 16 before we get to chapter 19. The first time you've heard this, some of you are going to be struggling with it. I know that. Don't worry about that. You'll hear it a second time eventually. I know there's elements of this that are tough, but stand back far enough from it and think about it, you'll see. You'll see it's there. Now, we read in Revelation 16 and verse 13 of the three unclean spirits like frogs, and they emanate from three mouths. They come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. And we have no problems with the false prophet. We know that's the Pope. What about the beast? The dragon, I should say, and the beast. Well, the way in which they're enumerated in verse 13 of Revelation 16 is strongly suggestive of the order of their destruction. The dragon is a reference to the power based in Constantinople. And that, of course, at the time of Armageddon will be the Russian power, the eastern leg of the image. And Gog will be destroyed in the land of Israel. So first to go down the gurgler. The army of Gog. Totally destroyed in the land of Israel. Then the beast comes next in the order of the emanation of these voices of three unclean spirits. The beast is the European nations, that is the reformed Holy Roman Empire, which is what the European Union is really about. They're subdued over a period of 40 years of conflict after Armageddon because they will support the Pope against Christ, and Elijah will destroy them through Israel as his weapon, as he brings them back through Europe. Then you have the false prophet, the papacy, the last enemy to be destroyed before the kingdom can be fully established. So there's your three mouths, and these represent, I believe, the order in which those powers will be destroyed in that 40-year period of judgment. So let's have a look at that in a chart form. This is the pattern of Roman Catholic resistance to Christ's rule for 40 years after Armageddon. Now bear in mind that here we've got Armageddon. So Christ has come 10 years prior to that to resurrect the dead and to do all the things he has to do to prepare them to be his army. So we're starting with the events of Armageddon. This is the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Okay? Now, in the Apocalypse, this is described in Revelation 14 as the harvest of the earth. Because Armageddon means a heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. You've got a harvest. But then what follows is the vintage of the earth in Revelation 14. This is the intense period. That's the 30 years from the destruction of Rome here. The hour of judgment leads to the destruction of that system. But then there's this destruction of the papacy which happens a little while before the end of that 40 years. Okay? The false prophet and the beast that support him are destroyed, but not all Catholics. Some Catholics, the remnant of Catholics, will remain. It's going to take a few years to get rid of all of them. I want to show you that. So there is the three stages. Now all of that, you know, is back in 1 Kings 19. Come back with me. 1 Kings 19. Again, I don't need to tell you the story of Elijah on Mount Horeb, because you know the story. He's there in a cave, the same one that Moses was in, we believe, and Yahweh passes by. He passes by in wind, earthquake and fire. And then finally, after he's retired to the back of the cave, hides his head in the mantle, he finally hears a still small voice, or the voice of a gentle whisper, and he comes out and he responds. God's teaching him a lesson. He's saying to Elijah, now listen here, Elijah, you've messed this up big time. You called fire down from heaven. Israel collapsed on their faces and said, I was God. And then you ran away. Judgments can make people sit up and pay attention. They don't change anybody. What changes people is education. Why are you down here? What are you doing down here? Why aren't you back in my land? Teaching the 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Oh, he doesn't know what to say. So he repeats the stupidity. I'm the only one left. Rubbish, Elijah. Why aren't you back there teaching them? That's what God's telling him. But that's not the only reason God does this. So when you see wind which passed by, earthquake that passed by, fire that passed by, you know what happens in 1 Kings 19? Have a look at verse 15. Because when this muddle-headed prophet, and he's still muddle-headed, hears what Yahweh has to say, you don't know what he's doing. He doesn't do these things. And he does one of these things. He anoints Elisha. He doesn't do the other two things. Elisha has to do that. Read verse 15. Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Didn't do it. Elisha did it. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. He didn't do it. Elisha did it. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat, of Abel Meholah, thou shalt anoint to be prophet in thy room. He did that one. And then retired. And then he heard the voice of a gentle whisper. Finally, took a while. Right? He was being taught a lesson. You can have blood and thunder and wind, earthquake and fire and make people pay attention, but you can't educate them that way. You educate them with a quiet, persistent voice of a gentle whisper to get through their thick skulls. That's what God's saying. Well, who are these? What do these represent? Well, they represent the three things he was supposed to do. The wind. Where do the winds come from into Israel? Oh, from Syria. Yeah. Anoint Hazael, king of Assyria. What about an earthquake? What was the greatest political earthquake in Israel's history of that time? Jehu's supposed reformation. Jehu getting rid of all Baal worshippers out of the land. Greatest earthquake of that time. And what about fire? Well, Elisha is called the son of Shaphat. You know what Shaphat means? Judgment. And one of his first works was a work of judgment. Remember when the blasphemous youths came out? They weren't children. The blasphemous youths came out and they said, "Go up, thou bald head, go up." You know what they were saying? They weren't just criticising a chap like me with no hair in his head. Right? Elisha didn't have any hair in his head. They weren't criticising baldness. They were saying, they say that Elijah was taken up by a wind, a whirlwind into heaven, and that you've now got his mantle. Come on, prove to us. Physician, heal thyself. You fly, come on. They say Elijah went up by a whirlwind. Now show us how you can fly, Elisha. Go up, you bald head. And out comes two bears and tears 42 youths to shreds. One of his first works is a work of judgment. He's Elisha, the salvation of Yah, the son of judgment. Got the picture? When that's done, guess what he becomes? Voice of a gentle whisper in Israel. Because there were 7,000 ready to listen. See that? Now that's what happened in history. But this is prophecy as well, you know. We want to see how it's prophecy. This is Revelation chapter 19, verses 19 to 20. You know what happens in this chapter. This is the destruction of the harlot system and the way it will be done. And what John sees is this vision of Christ sitting upon a white horse. I want you to have a look at the words. I want you to come to Revelation 19. Verse 11. And I saw heaven opened. Heaven opened, new government coming. And behold, a white horse. Now we know what white represents. It represents righteousness. What does a horse represent? War. Read on. And he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness, that's the white, doth he judge and make war. That's the horse. So who's the horse? Here. Israel. Proof? Isaiah 63. Verses 12 and 13. The work of Elijah in the second Exodus is likened to bringing Israel back through the wilderness of the peoples, and it says that they're going to be like a horse in the wilderness. Isaiah 63, 12 and 13. Alright? Horse is Israel. That's why in Revelation 14 it says that the blood in the treading out of the winepress of the wrath of God is up to the what? Horse bridles. What horse? Israel. Okay? But then, of course, we read about the saints who are following Christ on horses, white horses, in verse 14. We know they're the saints because they're wearing these garments, fine linen, white and clean, which in verse 8 we are told is the righteousness of the saints. Okay? So here you've got Christ and the saints using Israel as the vehicle of the destruction of the Catholic system. Now I told you, sorry.
Spiritual Israel. You mean spiritual Israel?
No. Israel, returning under Elijah. Israel returning under Elijah. The mortal Jews that are brought from all the countries into Europe, into the wilderness of the peoples, they're going to fight their way back to the land. In the second Exodus, it will take as long as the first one did, 40 years. And it's in that fighting their way back to the land through these resistant European nations who don't want to let them get back to the land because they're going to go back and serve Christ. And they're supporting the Pope against Christ. Alright? So Israel is used as God's battle axe, his horse in war. So how did Jezebel die? Dogs ate her when she was dead. That's not how she died. Yeah. Jehu ran over her with his horses. That's how she died. She was trampled to death by horses. Revelation 19. Christ and the saints riding upon horses, symbolic horses. Alright? And that symbolic horse is the nation of Israel returning under Elijah back to the land, having to fight their way back through Europe and crush the European nations who support the papacy, standing in their way. Got a picture? All back there in 1 Kings. Not history, brethren. Prophecy. That's why when I said that 85% of the Bible is actually prophecy, Old Testament is actually prophecy, not history, some of you looked at me as though I'm an idiot. You know, the fact is that most of that history is prophecy. Well, let's finish this off. Great Babylon, we are told in Revelation 16. By the way, while we're in Revelation 19, I do owe it to you one thing. We had up on the screen verses 19 and 20 of Revelation 19. And Revelation 19:20 says, and the beast, meaning the revived Holy Roman Empire, was taken, and with him the false prophet, meaning the Pope, that wrought signs. And at the end of the verse, these both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. But that's not the end of the story. There's another verse. Verse 21. It says this. And the remnant was slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse. So that when Christ and the saints finally destroy the Pope and the empire that supports him, it's not the end of Catholics. There's still remnant left. Now, as it stands at present, it's going to take 4 years to get rid of them. Christ comes this year, it's going to take 4 years. And I won't go into all the details of that now. We'll keep that for later on. So it's going to take a little while to get rid of that remnant. Let's come back to chapter 16 of Revelation. Revelation 16, verse 16, of course, we're familiar with it. He gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. And then we read that the seventh angel poured out his vial, and we get that 40-year period of judgment against Babylon the Great. All prefigured back here. Wind, earthquake and fire. In 1 Kings 19. How so? Well, we saw the three mouths, remember? Dragon, beast, false prophet, order of their destruction. When does the dragon go down the girdle? Armageddon. When does the beast go down? Over the next 40 years in the work of Elijah through Israel. When does the false prophet go down? We just read about it. Revelation 19, verse 20. It's in that order. And when you think about it, it was all back there, wasn't it? Those three stages, three things that happened to Elijah, prophetic of much that was in the future. And when that work's done and those three powers are destroyed utterly, what then's going to happen? Well, everyone that is left of all the nations are going to hear the voice of a gentle whisper through Elisha. Not the Elisha of old, but the Elisha of whom he was a type. Elisha means the salvation of Yah. He was a type of Christ, who's going to become not just the King of kings and Lord of lords, he's going to become the teacher of the nations through the saints. He shall speak peace unto the nations, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. All back there in the types. So when we look at this chart, brethren, on the return of Christ to raise the dead, to the time when Christ has his universal rule over all nations, the work we've been talking about is going on in here. Armageddon, through the destruction of the papal system, through Israel returning under Elijah, they're the weapon used against this system, all culminates with the abolition of the followers of Nimrod in the earth. That's where that comes from. And the promise is going to be kept. The promise that was made at the end of the letters of the fire of tyrants. He that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. And I will give him the morning star. You know where that's coming from? Psalm 2. It's quoted from Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9. You know what Psalm 2 is about? Why do the nations rage? Why do they gather together and set up a rebellion against Yahweh and his anointed? Yahweh says in verse 6 of that psalm, I have set my king upon my holy hill Zion. Christ has set up the throne of David. And they're in rebellion against him. The papal system in rebellion against him. They will bring to the fore their doctrine, the Jesuit doctrine of Antichrist. The wisest fellow in Jerusalem, after dramatic events, claimed to be the King of the Jews. He's an impostor, they say. Well, the Jesuits will get their way. And the Pope will oppose the rule of Christ. And that's why there's another 40 years to go after Armageddon. Get rid of this mob. Ultimately destroy the house of Nimrod in the earth. The next session is going to be a bit easy. Promise. Alright? But you can see, it's a bit complex, I agree. You can see the way that historical record of Ahab and Jezebel is used as a prophecy of the wonderful things to come. Just part of the message of the Scriptures.